They say the deadliest men in the West aren't the ones who wear their guns low and proud, or those who boast about their kill counts in smoky saloons. Ask any old-timer who survived the bloodiest days of the frontier, and they'll tell you the most dangerous are the quiet ones, the men whose hands tell stories their lips never will. In the annals of Western history, few figures embody this truth more than Thomas Swift-Hand Sullivan, though most folks who knew him in his later years never realized they were sharing streets with a living legend. Some called him the Whispering Death during the border wars. Others knew him as Dead-Eye Sullivan in the turbulent years that followed. But by 1875, in the growing town of Cedar Rapids, Colorado, he was just Tom the Carpenter, the mild-mannered craftsman whose weathered hands shaped wood into beauty with the same precision they had once used to end lives at distances that seemed impossible. "A man's reputation is like a shadow," Sullivan once told a young deputy who'd recognized him years later. "The longer the day wears on, the more it stretches and distorts until it barely resembles the truth." Then he'd gone back to planing wood, letting the curls of cedar fall like autumn leaves around his boots. Join me today as we explore the story of a man who tried to build a new life with a hammer and saw, only to discover that some reputations can't be buried deep enough. Before we dive in, tell us where you're watching from, and if you enjoy stories of the Old West, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's tale is one you won't want to miss. Cedar Rapids, Colorado Territory, summer of 1875. The town was growing faster than a Mustang at full gallop, its streets filled with the sound of construction and the optimistic chatter of new arrivals seeking their fortune in the shadow of the Rockies. The discovery of silver in the nearby mountains had transformed what was once a quiet trading post into a bustling frontier town, complete with all the opportunities and dangers such rapid growth brings. Thomas Sullivan's workshop sat at the edge of town, a tidy building that smelled of fresh-cut pine and linseed oil. Those who brought him work noticed two things: the remarkable steadiness of his hands as he took measurements, and the fact that he positioned his workbench where he could see both entrances clearly. If anyone thought it strange that a simple carpenter would have such situational awareness, they kept it to themselves. Sheriff Marcus Wade, new to his badge and eager to prove himself, was watching Sullivan shop from his office window when Marshal John Hawkins rode into town. The marshal's arrival wasn't a surprise. The increasing silver shipments had drawn more than just honest workers to Cedar Rapids. "Hear anything about the Keller gang?" Hawkins asked, dismounting outside the sheriff's office, his trail worn. Duster carried the dust of 5 territories, and his eyes had the hard look of a man who'd seen too much of humanity's darker nature. 3 robberies in the last month, Wade reported, getting bolder each time. "Word is they're planning something big, maybe aiming for the silver shipment coming through next week." The marshal nodded, his gaze drifting to Sullivan's workshop across the street. "Interesting town you got here, Sheriff. Everybody seems to have a story. Take that carpenter over there. Ever notice how he holds his tools? Seen men handle Colts the same way?" Before Wade could respond, the conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. 5 riders appeared at the end of Main Street, their horses kicking up dust as they headed straight for Sullivan's workshop. The lead rider, a man whose scarred face had earned him the nickname Slash Morgan, was well known as one of the Keller gang's main enforcers. What happened next would shatter the peace of Cedar Rapids forever, though none who witnessed it could have guessed that this was just the beginning. Sometimes the most dangerous storms are the ones that gather slowly, building their fury in plain sight while everyone looks the other way. But before we continue this tale, make sure you're subscribed to our channel, because the story of Thomas Sullivan and the secret he tried to keep buried is one that will change everything you think you know about the quiet men of the Old West. Slash Morgan and his men dismounted outside Sullivan's workshop with the casual arrogance of men used to having their way. The afternoon sun cast their shadows long across the freshly swept wooden porch, where a half-finished rocking chair sat waiting for its final coat of varnish. Inside, the steady rhythm of Sullivan's plane against wood continued uninterrupted, as if he hadn't noticed the approaching trouble. "Heard you're good with your hands, Carpenter," Morgan called out, his voice carrying the hint of a threat wrapped in false friendliness. The planing stopped, and Thomas Sullivan appeared in the doorway, a cotton rag in his hands, wiping away sawdust. He was tall but not imposingly so, with greying hair at his temples and eyes the colour of old steel. Nothing about his appearance suggested anything more dangerous than a lifetime of honest work. "Folks seem to think so," Sullivan replied quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Those who knew him had grown used to his soft-spoken nature, but something about it made Morgan's hand twitch near his holster. Across the street, Marshal Hawkins watched the scene unfold with growing interest. "You're Carpenter," he murmured to Sheriff Wade. "What do you know about him?" "Showed up about 8 months ago," Wade replied, his hand resting nervously on his own gun. "Does good work. Keeps to himself. Never caused any trouble. Never needed." "It too, I'd wager," Hawkins said cryptically. Back at the workshop, Morgan was making his pitch. "Way I see it, a man with your skills could be useful. Boss Keller's building himself a new place up in the hills. Needs someone who knows their way around. Would." He paused, letting the implied threat hang in the air. "Pays better than making chairs for farmers' wives." Sullivan wiped his hands methodically on the rag, his movements unhurried. Mary Chen, who ran the Chinese laundry next door, had stopped hanging sheets to watch. She'd seen men like Morgan before, back in San Francisco, men who confused silence with weakness. "I appreciate the offer," Sullivan said, folding the rag with precise movements. "But I've got all the work I need here." Morgan's scarred face twisted into something ugly. "Wasn't exactly an offer, friend. See Boss Keller, he doesn't like being told no. Bad for business." His hand moved closer to his gun, a motion matched by his companion's. "Maybe we need to show you what happens to folks who don't understand opportunity when it knocks." What happened next would be talked about in Cedar Rapids for years to come. Sullivan's hands moved, not to a weapon, but to the wooden plane on his workbench. "Interesting thing about carpentry," he said, his voice still quiet but carrying clearly in the tense silence. "You learn that every tool has its purpose. Take this plane here. Japanese white oak, brass fittings. Belonged to a master carpenter in San Francisco." Morgan blinked, thrown off by the seemingly irrelevant response. "What the hell are you talking about?" "Man who taught me to use it said something I never forgot," Sullivan continued, running his finger along the plane's smooth surface. "He said, the same principles that shape wood shape men. Patience, precision, purpose." His eyes met Morgan's, and for a moment something flickered in their depths that made the outlaw take an involuntary step back, and the understanding that some cuts, once made, can't be unmade. In his office, Marshal Hawkins had drawn his own conclusions. "Sheriff," he said quietly, "you might want to get the good doctor ready. Something tells me his services will be needed soon." The tension in the air had grown thick enough to cut with a knife. Morgan's men had spread out, instinctively adopting firing positions, though none had drawn yet. They'd come to intimidate a simple carpenter, but something about the situation had shifted in ways they couldn't quite understand. "Last chance," Morgan snarled, his composure cracking. "You either come with us nice and peaceful, or we show this whole town what happens to folks who don't know their place." Sullivan set the plane down with careful precision, arranging it perfectly, and parallel to the workbench's edge. "No," he said simply, "I don't believe I will." The word hung in the air like gun smoke before a shot, and every man on that porch knew that whatever happened next would change Cedar Rapids forever. What none of them realized, except perhaps Marshal Hawkins, was that they weren't about to teach a lesson, they were about to learn one. Morgan's hand moved for his gun with the speed that had made him famous in 3 territories. It was fast, but somehow Sullivan was faster. Before anyone could blink, the carpenter's hand had swept up a wooden mallet from his workbench and sent it spinning through the air. The tool caught Morgan's drawing hand with devastating precision, sending his revolver clattering across the porch, unfired. In the next instant, Sullivan was moving with a grace that seemed impossible for a man who spent his days working wood. He flowed like water around the first outlaw's wild punch, redirecting the man's momentum to send him crashing into his companion. Both went down in a tangle of limbs and curses. The fourth man managed to clear leather, but Sullivan was already inside his firing arc. The carpenter's elbow struck like a hammer against the outlaw's wrist, accompanied by the distinct sound of bones breaking. The gun dropped from nerveless fingers as its owner howled in pain. "Notice how he's not killing them," Marshal Hawkins commented to Sheriff Wade, who stood transfixed by the display. "Man who moves like that could have ended this already if he wanted to." The fifth member of Morgan's gang, a young hothead named Billy Reeves, tried to circle around for a clear shot. Sullivan seemed to sense the movement without looking, kicking a loose plank on the porch. The wood flipped up at an angle, catching Reeves under the chin and dropping him like a stone. Morgan, having recovered his weapon with his left hand, fired wildly. The bullet splintered the doorframe where Sullivan had been a split second before. The carpenter's response was devastatingly simple. He threw his favorite crosscut saw like a cavalry saber. The tool's wooden handle struck Morgan's temple with mathematical precision, and the scarred outlaw went down hard. In less than 30 seconds, 5 of the most feared men in the territory lay groaning or unconscious on Sullivan's porch. He hadn't drawn a weapon, hadn't even raised his voice. He stood among them now, straightening his work apron with the same careful attention he gave to aligning a joint. "Remarkable restraint," Marshal Hawkins murmured, already moving across the street. Most men with his skills would have reached for a gun. Mary Chen, still watching from her laundry, crossed herself and whispered something in Cantonese about tigers hiding in sheep's clothing. She'd seen fighting in her time, but nothing like this. This was art as much as violence, precision wielded. Like a craftsman's tool, Sullivan was already checking his fallen attackers, ensuring none were critically injured. He moved from man to man with professional efficiency, using his carpenter's knowledge of anatomy, gained from years of precision work, to assess their conditions. When Marshal Hawkins reached the porch, Sullivan was tying Morgan's hands. With a length of leather cord, his knots as precise as his joinery. "Been a while," Hawkins said quietly, "since I saw the man they used to call Swift Hand in action." Sullivan's hands paused for just a moment before resuming their work. "That name belonged to another life, Marshal. These men," Hawkins gestured to the groaning outlaws, "they work for James Keller. He won't take this lying down." "No," Sullivan agreed, his voice still barely above a whisper. "I expect he won't." He stood, surveying his handiwork with the critical eye of a craftsman. "Seems I've created quite a mess on my porch." Sheriff Wade, finally finding his voice, joined them. "I've never—" "How did you—" "Practice," Sullivan replied simply. "Everything's about practice, whether you're shaping wood or—" He left the sentence unfinished, but his meaning was clear. As a crowd began to gather, drawn by the commotion, Sullivan turned to Marshal Hawkins. "You'll want to get these men to the doctor. The one with the broken wrist needs attention first. The others are just bruised, mostly." Hawkins nodded, studying Sullivan with knowing eyes. "You do realize what's coming. Keller's got 30 men. He'll come at you with everything he has." Sullivan bent to retrieve his scattered tools, examining each for damage before returning it to its proper place. "Then I suppose," he said quietly, "I'll need to repair my porch first. A man should have his house in order before receiving visitors." The gathered townspeople whispered among themselves, looking at their carpenter with new eyes. They'd just witnessed something that defied explanation, but none of them could have guessed that this was merely the opening move in a game that would shake Cedar Rapids to its foundations. Word spread through Cedar Rapids like wildfire, growing more elaborate with each telling. By sunset, half the town claimed Sullivan had defeated 10 men, while the other half swore it was closer to 15. The truth, as Marshal Hawkins knew, was impressive enough without embellishment. 5 of Keller's best men, taken down by a carpenter, using nothing but workshop tools and precision that spoke of years of deadly experience. Dr. Samuel Chen, Mary's husband, had his hands full treating the injured outlaws in his small clinic. "Fascinating," he commented to Marshal Hawkins, examining Morgan's bruised temple. "Every injury precisely placed, painful but not lethal, the work of someone who knows exactly how much force to use." Like a carpenter measuring his cuts, Hawkins agreed, watching as deputies secured the prisoners. In the corner, young Billy Reeves was still rubbing his jaw, looking shell-shocked. The marshal approached him, seeing an opportunity. "First time you've run into someone like him, isn't it, boy?" Hawkins asked quietly. Reeves nodded, wincing at the movement. "Never seen anything like it," the young outlaw admitted. "Slash Morgan's. Supposed to be the fastest gun in 3 territories, but this Carpenter, he moved like—" Reeves struggled to find the words. "Like death walking in daylight." Morgan's voice came from the examination table, his eyes still closed. "I've heard stories about men like him. During the border wars, there was one they called Swift Hand Sullivan. They say he could kill a man. At 100 yards, with any weapon you gave him, didn't matter if it was a rifle, pistol, or a damn butter knife." Hawkins studied Morgan carefully. "Those stories ever mention why he disappeared? Some say he got tired of the killing, others say he died in a shootout in Kansas." Morgan opened his eyes, realization dawning. "Sweet Jesus, that's him, isn't it?" Back at his workshop, Sullivan was methodically repairing his porch, each hammer strike precise and measured. Rebecca Collins, the young schoolteacher, stood watching him work. She'd arrived in Cedar Rapids 6 months ago, about the same time as Sullivan, and had often brought him small repair jobs from the schoolhouse. "They're saying all sorts of things about you in town," she said finally. Sullivan continued working, his rhythm unbroken. "People usually do," he replied softly, setting another nail with perfect placement. "Are they true? Were you really some famous gunman?" Sullivan paused, testing a board's stability. "Names and reputations are funny things, Miss Collins. They tend to grow bigger than the truth." He looked up at her, his eyes gentle despite their steel-gray color. "Right now, I'm just a carpenter trying to fix his porch." At the Silver Dollar Saloon, James Keller was receiving the news of Morgan's defeat with dangerous calm. The gang leader was a different breed from common outlaws, educated, methodical, and utterly ruthless. He'd built his criminal empire through careful planning rather than brute force. "Interesting," Keller mused, studying a glass of expensive bourbon. "Very interesting indeed." He turned to his lieutenant, a former Army scout named Harass. "What do we know about this Carpenter?" "Showed up about 8 months ago," Harass reported. "Keeps to himself, does good work. But I've been asking around. Nobody seems to know where he came from. Just appeared one day with his tools and started taking jobs." Keller nodded thoughtfully. "And now he's handed 5 of our best men their hats, using nothing but carpenter's tools." A cold smile crossed his face. "Send word to our friends in Denver and Pueblo. I want every gun we can hire. If this Carpenter wants to play games, we'll give him more players than he can handle." Marshal Hawkins, watching Keller's men ride out of town, knew what was coming. He found Sullivan still working as darkness fell, now carefully sanding the repaired boards by lamplight. "Keller won't let this stand," Hawkins warned. "He's got connections all through the territories. He'll bring in professionals." Sullivan tested the smooth finish of a board with practiced fingers. "I know," he replied quietly. "That's why I'm taking extra care with these repairs. A man should have good, solid footing when trouble comes calling." The marshal shook his head slowly. "You could leave. No one would blame you. I left once before, Sullivan said, his voice carrying a weight of memory. Spent 8 years trying to build a new life with these hands. Now it seems these hands have to remember their old work. He looked up at the stars appearing in the darkening sky. No, Marshal, I won't run. Some things are worth standing for. As night settled over Cedar Rapids, lights twinkled in windows. Like nervous stars, everyone could feel it, the calm before the storm. The quiet Carpenter had become the center of a gathering whirlwind, and soon the whole town would be caught in its fury. Dawn painted the Colorado mountains gold as riders began arriving in Cedar Rapids. They came in ones and twos, hardened men with cold eyes and well-worn holsters. Each carried a deadly reputation and the skills to back it up. By noon, the Silver Dollar Saloon was filled with more professional killers than most territory capitals saw in a year. John "Quickshot" Wilson from Kansas, the Reeves brothers out of New Mexico, even the notorious Santiago Vasquez from the Mexican territories. Keller had spared no expense in gathering his army of gunmen. Sheriff Wade, watching from his office window, felt his stomach tighten with each new arrival. 23 so far, Marshal Hawkins reported, making another mark in his notebook. And these aren't common thugs. Every man in there has a price on his head in at least 2 territories. At his workshop, Sullivan continued his daily routine as if nothing had changed. The steady rhythm of his saw and hammer carried down the street, a counterpoint to the growing tension. He was working on a heavy oak dining table, commissioned by the banker's wife weeks ago. Dr. Chen stopped by, ostensibly to order a new cabinet for his clinic. Morgan and his men will be well enough to move to the jail tomorrow, he said quietly, watching Sullivan work. The young one, Reeves, he's been talking, says you moved like no one he's ever seen. Sullivan continued shaping a table leg with methodical precision. People see what they expect to see, Doctor. Sometimes that's more about them than the truth. And what is the truth, Mr. Sullivan? The carpenter tested the leg's balance before answering. The truth is simpler than most imagine. Every man has a choice about what he builds with his hands, beauty or destruction. He paused, running fingers along the grain of the wood. I've done both, prefer the former these days. In the saloon, James Keller was conducting a different kind of craftsmanship. He stood before his assembled gunmen, laying out his plan with the precision of a military commander. The carpenter's good, he acknowledged, but every man has limits. We'll test his. Quickshot. Wilson, notorious for his speed and accuracy, studied the crude map of town Keller had drawn. What's so special about this woodworker that you're willing to pay top dollar to handle him? Maybe nothing, Keller replied smoothly. Maybe everything. But he humiliated my men, and in our business, reputation is currency. Can't let that stand. Rebecca Collins, watching Sullivan's workshop from her schoolhouse window, made a decision. The children had been dismissed early due to the tension in town, and she found herself drawn to the steady sound of his work. She crossed the street, entering the familiar shop that now felt somehow different. Did you ever teach? She asked abruptly. Sullivan looked up, surprised. Your hands, she continued. The way you explain things about wood and craft. You have a teacher's patience. A shadow crossed Sullivan's face. Once, he admitted softly, had a school much like yours, back in Kansas. Taught marksmanship to Army scouts. Before, he let the sentence trail off, turning back to his work. Marshal Hawkins, visiting Mary Chen's laundry for intelligence, she saw everything from her vantage point, received disturbing news. More riders coming, she reported in her accented English. Big group from the east, bad men like snake about to strike. The marshal found Sullivan testing the finish on the dining table, his movements as calm and precise as ever. Keller's gathered quite an army, Hawkins said. Must be 30 professional gunmen in town now, with more on the way. 32, Sullivan corrected quietly, not looking up from his work. Including the 4 on the roof of the Mercantile, watching this shop. He ran his hand along the table's surface, checking for imperfections. You should get the good doctor to set up in the basement of the church. It's the strongest building. In town, you've counted every man, noted every position, Hawkins observed. Still got that tactician's eye. Sullivan finally looked up, his steel-grey eyes meeting the marshal's. Some skills, he said softly, are like riding a horse. The body remembers, even when the mind wishes it could forget. As evening approached, storm clouds gathered over the mountains, mirroring the darkness building in Cedar Rapids. The quiet, Carpenter had transformed the town into a powder keg, and everyone could sense that the fuse was already lit. The only question was, who would survive the coming explosion? The storm broke over Cedar Rapids just after sunset, turning the dusty streets to mud and casting strange shadows in the lamplight. Quick shot. Wilson, watching Sullivan's workshop from the Silver Dollar's second-floor window, couldn't shake an uneasy feeling. Something about the carpenter's continued calm struck him as deeply wrong. Man should be nervous, Wilson muttered to Santiago Vasquez, who was cleaning his prized matched revolvers. Got half the gunmen in the territory gunning for him, but he's out there in the rain, delivering a damn table. Indeed, Sullivan was carefully loading his finished oak table onto a wagon, protecting it from the rain with oiled canvas. Every movement remained precise, unhurried, as if he was completely unaware of the dozen pairs of eyes tracking his progress. Reminds me of something I saw in Mexico, Vasquez replied, his dark eyes distant with memory. Mountain lion, cornered by a pack of wolves, wasn't afraid, just patient. Wolves didn't understand until it was too late that they weren't the hunters. In his private room above the saloon, James Keller was meeting with the Reeves brothers. Unlike his other hired guns, the brothers had a reputation for more subtle work. I want to know everything, Keller instructed. Where he sleeps, what he eats, who he talks to. Every man has weaknesses. Find his. Meanwhile, Rebecca Collins was helping Dr. Chen and his wife move medical supplies to the church basement. The school teacher couldn't help but notice how the townsfolk were dividing into camps, those fleeing the coming violence and those preparing for it. He could have killed those men, Mary Chen said suddenly, arranging bandages. The ones on his porch. I saw his movements. He chose not to. Why? Rebecca asked, though she wasn't sure if she was questioning Mary or herself. Same reason tiger shows mercy, Mary replied cryptically. Because it can. Sheriff Wade found Marshal Hawkins in the telegraph office, sending messages to neighboring towns. Army patrols 3 days out, Hawkins reported grimly. We're on our own until then. Could call for volunteers, Wade suggested. Some of the miners might... No, Hawkins cut him off. Adding more guns to this powder keg won't help. Besides, he added, looking out at Sullivan's workshop where the carpenter was now apparently fixing his roof in the rain, something tells me he's got this measured out just like one of his projects. Sullivan had indeed been measuring, though not just his roofing work. Every new arrival in town, every shifted position of Keller's men was noted and calculated. As he worked, his mind mapped angles, distances, and possibilities with the same precision he used to plan complex joinery. The town's banker, Howard Matthews, approached the workshop, nervously eyeing the armed men, watching from various vantage points. "Mr. Sullivan," he called out, "my wife wanted to thank you for the table. It's beautiful work." Sullivan climbed down from the roof, wiping rain from his face. "Glad she likes it. Yellow oak's tricky to work with, but it'll last generations, if cared for properly." "Yes, well," Matthews shifted uncomfortably, "about your payment, given the current situation." "The agreed price is fine," Sullivan interrupted quietly. "Quality work deserves fair payment, no matter what storms are." brewing. As Matthews hurried away, Quickshot Wilson watched the exchange through his spyglass. "Don't understand it," he told Vasquez. "Man surrounded by killers probably won't live to see next week, and he's worried about proper payment for a table." "Perhaps," Vasquez replied thoughtfully, "that is why he is dangerous. A man who stays true to his principles in the face of death is a man who has already made peace with dying." The rain continued into the night, and with it came word of more riders approaching from the south. Keller's army was nearly complete. In his workshop, Sullivan worked late by lamplight, his saw and plane singing their steady song. He was crafting something small, detailed work that required all his concentration. Marshal Hawkins, making his evening rounds, stopped by. "Mind telling me what's so important it can't wait until after all this is settled?" Sullivan held up his project, a perfectly crafted wooden box sized to hold a single revolver. "Always believed," he said softly, "that if a man's going to die, he should leave something beautiful behind, just in case." His hands moved steadily over the wood, smoothing invisible imperfections. "Though I don't plan on dying just yet. Still got orders to fill." Dawn came grey and cold to Cedar Rapids, the aftermath of the storm, leaving puddles that reflected the leaden sky. The Reeves brothers made their first move just as the sun began to peek over the mountains. They approached Sullivan's workshop, leading a nervous young boy, tears streaking his dirty face. "Found him wandering the streets," the older Reeves called out. "Says his pa works the silver mine. Got himself hurt real bad up there." The boy nodded frantically, clearly terrified. "Needs someone with a wagon to help bring him down." Sullivan stood in his doorway, wiping his hands on his apron. Those watching couldn't tell if he was studying the brothers or the crying child. "Interesting," he said softly, "considering the mine's been closed 3 days for safety inspections." His quiet voice carried clearly in the morning air. "Tommy Matthews, does your father know you're helping these men?" The banker's son froze, his eyes widening. The younger Reeves brother's hand dropped to his gun, but Sullivan was already moving. 2 wooden dowels flew from his fingers with deadly accuracy, striking nerve points in the gunman's wrists. Their weapons clattered to the mud before they could clear leather. "Tommy," Sullivan said calmly, as if nothing had happened, "your mother's probably worried. Best run along home." The boy bolted, leaving the Reeves brothers nursing their numbed hands. "Dowels of ironwood," Sullivan explained, his voice still quiet. "Dense enough to temporarily deaden the nerves when applied precisely. Should wear off in an hour." He turned back to his workshop. "Tell Keller that using children will only make things worse for him." Marshal Hawkins, watching from the jail, shook his head in amazement. "Man's got ice water in his veins," he told Sheriff Wade, "but Keller won't take this humiliation lightly." He was right. By noon, Keller had gathered his gunmen for a new strategy session. Quick shot, Wilson studied the carpenter's workshop through his spyglass, reporting every detail. "Place is built like a fortress," he noted. 2 exits, clear lines of sight in all directions. Man knows defensive positioning. "What about the schoolteacher?" Keller asked, his cold eyes calculating. "He seems protective of her." Santiago Vasquez shifted uncomfortably. "She's not part of this, Jefe. Going after women isn't." "Everything's part of this," Keller snapped. "Man like Sullivan, he's got to have a weakness. If it's not fear for his own life, maybe it's fear for others." Rebecca Collins was unaware of these discussions as she taught her afternoon classes. She'd refused to close the school despite the tension in town, believing routine would help calm the children's fears. The sound of Sullivan's saw from across the street provided a strangely comforting backdrop to her lessons. Shortly after the children left for home, 3 of Keller's men entered her classroom. "Evening, Mom," their leader said with false politeness. "Boss would like a word with you about your carpenter friend." Before they could take another step, a familiar quiet voice spoke from the doorway. "Gentlemen," Sullivan said softly, "I believe you took a wrong turn." He held a long timber across his shoulders, as if he'd been in the middle of carrying it. 3 guns against a piece of wood. One of the men sneered. "Bad odds, Carpenter." Sullivan's smile was barely visible. "Interesting thing about leverage," he said, his grip shifting slightly on the timber. "Proper application of force can overcome any odds." The wood moved like lightning in his hands, sweeping 2 men off their feet before they could draw. The third managed to clear his holster, but Sullivan's timber caught his gun hand with surgical precision, sending the weapon spinning away. In seconds, all 3 men lay groaning on the schoolroom floor. Sullivan hadn't even dropped his lumber. "Miss Collins," he said politely, "might I suggest waiting for Marshal Hawkins before leaving today? These gentlemen will need some help getting back to the saloon." Rebecca stared at the fallen men, then at Sullivan. "How did you know they were coming?" "Measured their shadows through the window," he replied, as if this was the most natural thing in the world. Angle was wrong for regular visitors. He turned to leave, then paused. "Also, Miss Collins, might want to keep the children inside tomorrow. Weather's looking uncertain." As he walked away, timber still balanced on his shoulders, Rebecca couldn't help but notice how he moved, like a man who had spent years calculating every step, every angle, every possibility. She wondered how many other measurements he'd taken, how many other shadows he'd studied while everyone thought he was just a simple carpenter. The humiliation of his men at the schoolhouse pushed James Keller into a cold rage. As evening approached, he gathered his most trusted killers in the Silver Dollar's back room. "No more games," he announced, his cultured voice carrying an edge of steel. "Tomorrow we end this, one way or another." Quick shot. Wilson noticed something different about the gang leader's demeanor. "What changed?" he asked carefully, aware of Keller's volatile temper. "Got a telegram from Kansas City," Keller replied, sliding a paper across the table. "Finally found out who our Carpenter really is. During the border wars, he wasn't just some famous gunman. He was a government specialist, trained Army scouts in advanced marksmanship and tactical combat." Santiago Vasquez picked up the telegram, his dark eyes widening as he read. "Says here he could put 10 bullets through the same hole at 100 yards, using different weapons." "That's not the interesting part," Keller continued, his voice growing colder. "After the war, he ran a special school for the Army, trained men in everything from shooting to hand-to-hand combat, until one day a gang tried to rob the school's payroll, killed his wife, who was teaching there. Sullivan tracked them for 2 years, hunted down every last one." "How many?" someone asked. 27 men, never used the same method twice. Some he shot, some he trapped, some just disappeared." Keller's face twisted into a grimace. "Then he vanished himself. Everyone thought he was dead." At his workshop, Sullivan was preparing for the coming storm in his own way. He'd spent the afternoon carefully positioning his tools and workbenches, creating what looked like casual clutter, but was, to his tactical eye, a carefully planned battlefield. Marshal Hawkins found him testing the balance of several wooden implements. "Heard about what happened at the school," the lawman said. "Keller's getting desperate." "Yes," Sullivan agreed quietly, selecting a particular length of hardwood doweling. "He'll come at night, try to overwhelm with numbers." He looked up at the marshal. "You should get the townsfolk away from Main Street, especially the Chens. Their laundry's too close to the line of fire." "They won't leave," Hawkins replied. "Mary says they've run from violence before, not again." He watched Sullivan continue his preparations. "That telegram from Kansas, about the school." "Sarah," Sullivan said softly, the name carrying years of pain. "She taught reading and writing while I handled the tactical training. She loved working with the young scouts, helping them learn more than just shooting." His hands moved steadily over the wood, but his eyes were distant. "She died protecting our students. Took a bullet meant for a 16-year-old boy." Rebecca Collins, who had quietly entered the workshop, heard this last part. "That's why you became the man they feared," she said. It wasn't a question. "No," Sullivan corrected gently, testing the weight of a mallet. "I became the man they feared, because fear was the only language they understood. But that's not who I am anymore." He set the mallet down with precise care. "Now I build things, try to create instead of destroy." "Yet here you are, preparing for violence," Hawkins observed. Sullivan's smile was sad but determined. "Sometimes you have to destroy something to protect what you've built. It's like working with wood. Sometimes you have to cut away the damaged parts to save the whole." As darkness fell, Quickshot Wilson watched the carpenter's methodical preparations through his spyglass. "Man's turning his whole shop into some kind of trap," he reported to Keller, "moving things around, setting up angles." "Good," Keller replied, his cultured voice now carrying an edge of anticipation. "Let him prepare. Tomorrow night we hit him with everything, every gun, every man. No one's that good." In the growing darkness, Sullivan lit a single lamp in his workshop. The light cast his shadow tall against the wall as he moved through his final preparations. Each tool was checked, each angle measured, each possible approach considered with the same precision he used in his finest woodwork. "A man's last stand should be his finest work," he whispered to himself, words his old shooting instructor had once said. As if in response, thunder rolled in the distance. Another storm was coming to Cedar Rapids, but this one would be made of lead and gunpowder rather than rain and lightning. The attack began just after midnight, but not how anyone expected. Keller's men had positioned themselves around Sullivan's workshop, ready for an all-out assault, when the carpenter made the first move. The shop's front door opened, spilling lamplight into the street, and Sullivan's quiet voice carried clearly in the night air. "Mr. Keller," he called softly, "your men in the livery stable are finding it hard to breathe about now." His tone was conversational, as if discussing the weather. "The sawdust I stored there this morning, mixed with certain oils, the fumes, can be quite overwhelming." Sure enough, 3 gunmen stumbled out of the stable, coughing and gasping. They'd been positioned to cover the workshop's back door, and now that position was compromised. A quick shot. Wilson, watching from his vantage point, felt a chill run down his spine. The carpenter had prepared this move hours ago, just waiting for the right moment. The 4 men in the mercantile's upper room, Sullivan continued calmly, still unseen in his doorway, might want to step carefully. "Those floorboards I replaced last week, they're not as sturdy as they appear." A loud crack followed his words, and shouts of alarm echoed as the gunmen scrambled to safer positions. Keller, positioned behind the saloon with his remaining forces, felt his careful plan unraveling. "He's trying to spook us," he growled. "Move!" And now, but Sullivan wasn't finished. As the first wave of gunmen advanced, they found the street itself had been prepared. Carefully placed timber fragments rolled underfoot, sending men sprawling. Others found themselves caught in loops of leather strapping, concealed in the mud but pulled taut at precisely the right moment. "Notice how he's still not killing anyone," Marshal Hawkins commented to Sheriff Wade as they watched from the jail. They'd been ordered to stay out of it by Sullivan himself, who'd insisted this was his fight alone. He's dismantling Keller's army piece by piece, just like he'd take apart a broken chair. Santiago Vasquez, trying to circle around behind the workshop, discovered his own carefully planned route blocked. Every approach had been subtly altered during Sullivan's daily work routine. A new fence here, a stack of timber there, each change funneling attackers exactly where the carpenter wanted them. Remarkable preparation, Dr. Chen observed from his makeshift clinic in the church basement, where he'd already begun treating the first casualties. None fatal, but all precisely incapacitated. Like a surgeon planning his cuts before the first incision, Rebecca Collins, who'd refused to leave town despite Sullivan's warnings, watched from her schoolhouse window as the Carpenter's defenses unfolded. Each trap and counter seemed to flow naturally into the next, like a complex piece of joinery where every part supported the whole. "The water barrel on the roof," Sullivan's voice came again, still eerily calm. "The one I filled this morning. It's rigged to tip." He paused meaningfully. "Might want to clear the alley, gentlemen. Water and black powder don't mix well." Several more of Keller's men scrambled for cover, their carefully positioned ambush now impossible. In the confusion, no one noticed Sullivan's shadow moving between positions, each motion calculated and precise. More men fell, not to bullets, but to precisely thrown tools and strategically placed obstacles. "He's making us look like fools." "Quick shot," Wilson spat, watching another group of gunmen stumble into a tangle of deliberately placed guide wires. "A whole army of killers, being picked apart by a man who hasn't even drawn a gun yet." Keller, his face twisted with rage, finally lost his patience. "Burn him out," he roared. "Burn the whole damn street if you have to." But even here, Sullivan had prepared. As the first torches were lit, sudden jets of water sprayed from seemingly innocent rain barrels, positioned days ago. The Carpenter's voice came once more, now carrying an edge of steel beneath its quietness. "Fire's a dangerous tool, Mr. Keller. Like any tool, it needs to be respected." The sound of a match being struck echoed in the darkness. "For instance, that pile of sawdust your men are standing near. It's not just sawdust." The night erupted in a controlled flash of flame that sent more gunmen scrambling, their nerve finally breaking. Sullivan had created a battlefield where every piece of ordinary carpentry became a weapon, every routine task a preparation for this moment. "Still think he's just a carpenter?" Hawkins asked Wade, watching as more of Keller's men retreated in. Confusion, but both lawmen knew the real battle hadn't even begun. This was just Sullivan's opening move, a carefully crafted demonstration of what he could do. The true test would come when Keller, pushed to desperation, finally ordered his remaining men to rush the workshop en masse. Keller's remaining men regrouped behind the saloon, their confidence shaken, but their numbers still formidable. The gang leader's cultured veneer had cracked, revealing the savage beneath. 20 men at once," he snarled. "Rush him from all sides. No one can fight those odds." Quick shot. Wilson wasn't so sure. "He's been 2 steps ahead all night," he warned. "Man like that, he's got to have planned for a rush." "Then die trying," Keller roared, his composure finally shattering. $500 extra to the first man who puts a bullet in him." In his workshop, Sullivan continued his preparations with methodical calm. He'd positioned his workbenches to create a maze-like pattern, each piece of furniture placed with tactical precision. Tools were arranged within easy reach, their positions measured down to the inch. Marshal Hawkins, watching through his spyglass, noticed something odd. "He's setting up his pieces like it's a chess game," he told Wade. "Look at how everything's positioned in relation to everything else." Rebecca Collins, who'd moved to the relative safety of the jail at Sullivan's insistence, understood something the gunman didn't. "He's not defending the workshop," she said quietly. "He's defending his home. This is where he rebuilt his life after Sarah died." The rush came just before dawn, when the grey light made shadows treacherous and depth perception uncertain. 20 men charged from different directions, guns blazing. They expected to overwhelm the lone Carpenter through sheer numbers. Instead, they found themselves in Sullivan's carefully crafted killing ground. The first wave stumbled over tripwires made from leather strapping, falling into each other. Sullivan's voice came from everywhere and nowhere, accompanied by the sound of rolling wooden barrels. "Pine's an interesting wood," he said conversationally, "especially when cut into small, round pieces. Hundreds of wooden balls, precisely sized and sanded smooth, spilled across the floor. Men lost their footing, shots went wild. and in the confusion, Sullivan moved like a ghost through his own workshop. His tools became weapons in his hands, a chisel thrown with surgical precision to disarm, a mallet swung to incapacitate, a length of hardwood doweling used to deflect and strike. "Sweet Jesus," Santiago Vasquez breathed, watching from his position. "He's not even using a gun. He's taking them apart like he's dismantling old furniture." Indeed, Sullivan moved through the chaos with the same precision he used in his craftwork. Every strike was measured, every movement efficient. Men went down to carefully placed blows or found themselves tangled in precisely positioned obstacles. The workshop itself seemed to fight against the intruders, its very layout turning their numbers against them. Keller, seeing his men fall into Sullivan's trap, made his most desperate move. "The schoolhouse!" he shouted. "Burn it! Let's see how well he fights when his lady friend's building is on fire!" Two men broke away, running toward the school with torches. They made it halfway before Sullivan's voice cut through the dawn light. "The pillars on the schoolhouse porch," he said quietly. "I replaced them last month." As if on cue, the wooden columns broke apart, releasing a deluge of water that had been sealed inside. The torches sputtered out, and the would-be arsonists found themselves facing Sullivan himself, who had appeared as silently as a shadow. "Yellow pine for the pillars," he explained, his voice still calm as he methodically disabled both men with precise strikes. "Looks solid, but holds water like a barrel if you hollow it right. Quick shot." Wilson, watching the carpenter's deadly dance through his workshop, finally understood. "He didn't just prepare the battlefield," he told Vasquez. "He's been preparing it for months. Every repair job, every piece of woodwork, it was all part of his defense." In the growing light, the extent of Sullivan's strategy became clear. Not a single attacker had been killed, but more than half of Keller's force lay groaning on the ground, each disabled with surgical precision. The workshop floor was littered with dropped weapons and fallen men, all positioned exactly where Sullivan had planned for them to be. Keller, his face contorted with rage, realized his carefully gathered army was being dismantled by a man who hadn't yet fired a shot. "This ends now," he snarled, drawing his own gun. "Time to see if the famous Marksman bleeds like other men." But Sullivan's quiet voice carried a note of finality. "No, Mr. Keller. Now it's time to show you why they once called me Swift Hand." The carpenter finally reached for something hidden beneath his workbench, and even Marshal Hawkins held his breath, knowing the legend was about to prove itself true. From beneath his workbench, Sullivan withdrew not a gun, but a simple wooden box, the one Marshal Hawkins had watched him craft the night before. His movements were unhurried as he opened it, revealing a Colt revolver nestled in perfectly. Carved grooves. The weapon gleamed in the dawn light, obviously well maintained despite years of disuse. "It's been 8 years since I touched this," Sullivan said softly, lifting the gun with familiar precision. "Made a promise to Sarah that I'd never draw it again, unless there was no other choice." His eyes met Keller's across the workshop. "Congratulations, Mr. Keller, you've finally forced that choice. Quick shot." Wilson, despite his years of experience, felt his mouth go dry. The way Sullivan held that Colt, it wasn't the grip of a man who'd forgotten his skills. It was the comfortable hold of a master picking up his favorite tool. "One gun against 8 men, Keller sneered, though those watching noticed he'd stepped behind his remaining gunman. "Even the famous Swift Hand can't beat those odds." Sullivan's smile was sad, but determined. "Interesting thing about odds," he replied, his voice still quiet. "They're like measuring wood. It's not about how many pieces you have. It's about how precisely you use them. The next few seconds would be talked about in Cedar Rapids for generations." Sullivan moved like flowing water, each motion precise and economical. His first shot caught the gun from Wilson's hand with surgical accuracy. The second bullet knocked the weapon from Santiago Vasquez's grip before the Mexican gunfighter could even aim. The third and fourth shots came so close together they sounded like a single. Report, disarming 2 more men with clockwork precision. Not one bullet drew blood. Each shot struck steel and wood with mathematical certainty. 8 men, 12 bullets. Marshal Hawkins commented to Rebecca from the jail's window. He won't need all of them. Indeed, Sullivan's next 3 shots proved the marshal right. More guns went flying, their owners nursing stung hands, but otherwise unharmed. The carpenter moved through his shop like a dancer, using the maze of workbenches and tools he'd created to control the battlefield. 7 shots, Sullivan counted calmly. 7 guns. He turned to face Keller, who now stood alone, his remaining men having lost their nerve. Simple arithmetic, really. Like measuring twice to cut once. Keller, desperate and enraged, made his final mistake. He grabbed one of his fallen men's guns and fired wildly. The bullet splintered the workbench near Sullivan's head, sending wood, chips flying. The carpenter's response was inevitable and precise. A single shot rang out. Keller's gun flew from his hand, accompanied by a cry of pain. But Sullivan wasn't finished. In one fluid motion he closed the distance between them, moving past the scattered tools and fallen men with practiced ease. The thing about violence, Mr. Keller, Sullivan said softly, standing over the gang leader, is that it's like working with hardwood. You have to understand the grain, how it flows, how it breaks. He holstered his Colt with deliberate care. I spent years learning those patterns. Then I spent years trying to forget them. Dr. Chen, arriving to tend the wounded, was struck by the precise nature of the injuries. Every shot perfectly placed, he murmured to Marshal Hawkins. Disabled without killing, the work of a surgeon with a gun. In the growing daylight, the full extent of Sullivan's victory became clear. Nearly 30 professional gunmen lay scattered around his workshop, each one incapacitated but none fatally wounded. Every shot, every move, every preparation had been measured and executed with the same precision he used in his carpentry. You could have killed them all, Marshal Hawkins observed, watching as Wade and his deputies began taking the wounded into custody. Probably would have been easier. Sullivan was already turning back to his workbench, where the unfinished rocking chair still waited. Easy isn't always right, Marshal. Sarah taught me that. He ran his hands over the smooth wood, checking for damage from the fight. Besides, I'm a carpenter now. I build things. Even when I have to fight, I'd rather not destroy. As the sun rose fully over Cedar Rapids, Sullivan carefully returned his Colt to its wooden box. The legend of Swift Hand had emerged one final time, but now it would give way to the quiet expertise of the carpenter. He had defended his home, protected his new life, and done it all with the precise measurement and careful execution that marked everything he created.